Why is my son's child crying at his grave with a stranger? Eleanor's voice cracked like thunder over the cemetery silence. The waitress clutched the boy tighter and said, "Because he still waits for a grandma who never came." The boy's green eyes mirrored Samuel's, and Eleanor realized this wasn't just a stranger. This was a piece of her blood. Have you ever discovered a family secret that shattered everything you believed? Share your thoughts below. The wind howled softly across the cemetery as a light rain fell over the cold marble of stones. Eleanor Whitmore stood frozen, her manicured fingers tightening around a bouquet of white lilies. She had come to grieve quietly, alone, as she had every month for the past 3 years since her son Samuel's tragic car accident. But this time was different. In front of Samuel's grave stood a young black woman in a waitress uniform, holding a small boy. They were crying. The child's tears fell silently as the woman whispered something only he could hear. Eleanor's heels clicked sharply on the wet stone as she approached. "Excuse me," she said, her voice hard and clear. "This is a private moment." The woman turned, startled but not afraid. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice trembling. "I didn't think anyone would be here today." Eleanor's eyes narrowed. "Who are you?" she asked, scanning the stranger's tear-streaked face. Then she looked at the boy. Something about him, the shape of his jaw, the curve of his lips, and those eyes, vivid green, just like Samuel's. "My name is Grace Morgan," the woman said, steadying her voice. "And this is Ethan. He's your grandson." The words didn't compute at first. Eleanor felt her knees buckle slightly. "That's not possible," she whispered. Grace knelt beside the boy, brushing back his curly hair. "Samuel loved Ethan. He would have told you if—" Eleanor interrupted. "He never told me anything." She stepped back, her world spinning. Samuel had secrets, and now one of them was staring at her with familiar eyes. As the rain thickened, Eleanor dropped her lilies. They scattered across the grave, unnoticed. She had come to mourn a lost son and found a child who might change everything. What else had her son hidden? And who truly was this woman? The rain had barely dried on her black umbrella when Eleanor returned to Whitmore Holdings, her family's empire built on steel, oil, and silence. That evening, she sat in her personal library, its shelves lined with dusty volumes and centuries of dominance. But her mind wasn't on stock prices or quarterly earnings. It was on a waitress with trembling hands and a child with Samuel's eyes. The mystery festered. "Leonard," she called out to her assistant, who stood by the door with his ever-ready notepad. "Find out everything about Grace Morgan and the child, Ethan." Within hours, folders began stacking like dominoes across the mahogany table. Grace Morgan, age 27, works 2 jobs, morning shifts at a bakery, night shifts at Harbor's Diner. No criminal record, no extended family. Lives in a 1-bedroom walk-up in the South End. A file labeled Ethan Morgan was thinner, conspicuously so. Eleanor flipped it open. No birth certificate, no hospital records, no mention of a father. "What game is she playing?" she muttered. Leonard didn't answer. The next morning, Grace received a call she didn't expect. A man with a clipped voice informed her she had an appointment at 2 p.m. with Eleanor Whitmore herself. Grace stared at her cracked phone, her heartbeat loud in the silence of her kitchen. She pulled her only formal suit from the back of her closet, one she had bought secondhand for job interviews she never landed. As she arrived at the Whitmore Tower, its glass facade glinted under the winter sun like a blade. Grace's breath caught. This place was another world. But she stepped through its revolving doors with Ethan's small handprint still warm on her coat sleeve. Her love for that boy had weathered more than fear. On the 58th floor, Eleanor's office resembled a palace. Floor-to-ceiling windows gazed across the city, casting long shadows on leather and oak. Eleanor didn't offer a greeting. "Sit," she said. "I'd rather stand." "Very well," Eleanor said coldly. She slid a manila folder toward her. "I've had you looked into. You're barely surviving. That boy is my grandson. He deserves more than thrift stores and leftover soup. He deserves legacy, education. The life my son never got." Grace's face tightened. Ethan is well-fed, well-read, and loved. I'm offering you a way out, Eleanor said, opening a silver checkbook. She scribbled something. $200,000. Walk away. He comes with me. You can visit on weekends. Grace stared at the check. Her hands didn't tremble. Her voice didn't shake. You're trying to buy my son? Her voice rose. No, I'm claiming my bloodline. Grace smiled bitterly. He's not your legacy. He's my life. Your life is barely functional, Eleanor snapped. That child deserves private schools, piano lessons, summers in Provence. And love, Grace said softly, which I give him, something you clearly didn't give your son. The room went still. Eleanor leaned back, shaken for the first time in years. Grace didn't flinch. I'm not here to sell Ethan, she said. I'm here because he believes in family, even when the family doesn't believe in him. Grace's fingers tightened around the torn pieces of the check as they fluttered to the marble floor like wounded birds. The silence in the office stretched until it became suffocating. Eleanor Whitmore, queen of empires, used to boardroom conquests and courtroom victories, stared at the fragments of her offer as if they were shards of her pride. Grace stood tall, chin lifted, her voice low but unwavering. You really thought I'd sell my son for 6 digits on glossy paper? Eleanor's face twitched, the smooth veneer of power slipping. You don't understand the world he's meant to live in. You mean your world, Grace shot back. The world that chewed your son up and left him hollow. That stung. Eleanor rose slowly, towering above Grace like a statue cast in steel. You work 2 jobs to pay rent in a building with roaches and peeling paint? You think bedtime stories and microwave dinners are enough? Grace's laugh was short and dry. Funny, because all those stories and meals came with something Samuel never had. A mother who looked him in the eye and said, I'm proud of you. Eleanor flinched. You don't know me. No, Grace said, voice softening. But I knew him. I knew how he longed for your attention, how he waited for calls that never came. I was there when he cried over missed birthdays and unopened letters. Eleanor's eyes flashed. You think I don't carry regrets? I think you carry shame, Grace replied, and you think Ethan is your redemption. Eleanor slammed her hand on the desk. You're selfish. You're standing in the way of his future. No, Grace said. I'm protecting it. Eleanor's lips curled. Then we'll do this the hard way. I have attorneys, politicians, people who owe me favors you can't begin to imagine. Grace's expression didn't change. You think power lies in money, but you forget, money doesn't raise a child. It doesn't teach them kindness or courage. Eleanor leaned forward. You're a waitress. What can you possibly give him that I can't? Grace looked her straight in the eye. My time, my heart, and a name that means love, not control. For a moment, Eleanor was silent, stunned by the clarity of the answer. But then she smiled coldly. This isn't over. Grace picked up her purse, turned to the door, and said over her shoulder, No, it's just beginning, and next time it'll be on my terms. As she walked out, the torn check still lay on the floor like confetti from a celebration that never happened. Eleanor stared after her, unsure whether she had just lost a negotiation or something far more valuable. Outside, the winter wind blew hard against the glass walls, but Grace walked straight through it, heart pounding, eyes dry. She had just stared down a billionaire and walked away with her dignity intact. But deep down, she knew the war was only starting, and the next move had to be perfect. 3 nights after the confrontation in the towering office of Eleanor Whitmore, Grace sat quietly in her modest apartment, the ticking of a wall clock marking time like distant drum beats. Ethan was asleep in the next room, his favorite blanket wrapped around him, unaware that his world was shifting. On the small kitchen table beneath a flickering overhead bulb, a different kind of family had gathered. They didn't wear suits or speak in boardroom lingo, but their words carried weight. Dr. Gregory Fields, law professor from Columbia, adjusted his glasses and flipped through a thick binder. Every contract, every shell company, every bribe, we have it documented. You've done your homework. Next to him, Rachel Delgado, an investigative journalist with a sharp eye and sharper instincts, tapped rapidly on her laptop. This makes Watergate look like kindergarten. Across from Grace sat Margaret Ellis, Her aunt, her mentor, her rock. Decades ago, Margaret had taught business law at the University of Chicago and had seen firsthand how power twisted people. She looked at Grace now, her eyes filled with quiet pride. "Are you sure you're ready?" Grace nodded, her voice steady. "I've been preparing for 3 years. Every night shift, every law class, every connection I made was for this moment. I'm not just fighting for Ethan. I'm fighting for what Samuel died trying to uncover." Margaret reached across the table and placed her hand over Grace's. "Your mother would be proud. She always said knowledge was the only inheritance no one could steal." Just then, Grace's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen. "Eleanor." Without hesitation, she answered and put it on the speaker. "What game are you playing?" Eleanor's voice cracked like cold glass. "Hiring Morrison and Pierce? You think that scares me?" Grace remained calm. "I warned you, Eleanor. There's more to me than you thought." "Don't be naive. The courts will side with me. They always do." "Not this time," Grace said, glancing at the documents on the table. "Because this time, the truth is louder than money." "Truth doesn't pay lawyers," Eleanor snapped. Rachel smiled and mouthed, "She's rattled." Grace replied softly, "You're right. But exposing how you bought silence, buried mistakes, and stole a legacy, that truth, it's priceless to the people who care." A pause, then Eleanor's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. "You're bluffing." Rachel leaned in. "Hello, Miss Whitmore. This is Rachel Delgado, Metropolitan Times. I'd like your official comment on the series we're about to publish." The line went dead. The room stayed silent until Margaret chuckled. "Well done." Dr. Fields closed the binder. "We file tomorrow." Grace exhaled slowly. She had been waiting for this, training for this, dreaming of this moment since the day she held Samuel's dying wish in her hands. Outside the window, the city lights flickered like stars. Inside, Grace felt something stir. Not revenge, not rage, but purpose. She was no longer just a waitress. She was a guardian of truth, a keeper of legacy, and the storm Eleanor never saw coming. By dawn, the storm Grace had warned Eleanor about had started to break across headlines, inboxes, and government channels like a silent avalanche. At precisely 8 o'clock p.m., Eleanor's lead attorney, Philip Reeves, called her from his corner office downtown, and the urgency in his voice was unmistakable. "Eleanor, we've been blindsided." "By what?" she snapped, still in silk pajamas, her coffee untouched. "Grace Morgan has retained Morrison, Caldwell, and Pierce, pro bono." Eleanor nearly dropped her phone. That firm, renowned for civil rights cases and undefeated in family court battles, was the last name she expected. "She's a waitress," Eleanor whispered, gripping the phone tighter. "How the hell did she manage that?" "We're trying to find out," Philip said. "But there's more." They filed an emergency motion claiming any attempt to remove the child by force would constitute legal kidnapping under precedent of socioeconomic discrimination. It's airtight, and it's public now. Eleanor stood up, her silk robe falling off one shoulder as she walked to the window. Below her, the city buzzed unaware, but for the first time in years, she felt the walls closing in. "Find a judge. I don't care how much it costs. Get me custody." But it was already too late. Across town, Rachel Delgado sat in a coffee shop with Margaret and Grace, reviewing the final proofs for a 3-part expose. Titles like Heir to Lies, Inside Whitmore Industries, and The Price of Silence, How Wealth Buried a Family, glowed on her laptop. "It's going live at midnight," Rachel said, "and the paper has already notified the IRS." Grace nodded. Her hands were cold, but her voice was clear. "Let them come." "I'm not afraid." Just then, Ethan walked in from his room, rubbing his eyes. "Mama, can I have pancakes?" Grace smiled, bending to kiss his forehead. "Of course, sweetheart, with extra syrup." That tiny moment, so normal, so intimate, was the entire reason she was willing to go to war. Back in Eleanor's penthouse, the television flickered with a breaking news banner. Stock for Whitmore Holdings was tumbling. Anonymous sources had leaked internal documents. Images flashed of executives leaving with boxes in their arms, legal documents in hand. Her assistant Leonard hovered at the door, his face pale. "Ma'am, the IRS just issued a subpoena, and the SEC is freezing accounts pending review." No, Eleanor whispered. She stumbled backward as if the news had physically struck her. This is a mistake. I control this world. I own the rules. But even she knew the tide had turned. She reached for the phone and dialed Grace's number. When Grace answered, Eleanor didn't shout. She hissed. You did this? Grace didn't raise her voice either. No, you did this when you tried to buy a child. I'll destroy you. With what? Grace asked. Frozen assets and a collapsing empire? Eleanor's hands trembled. You'll regret this. Grace's voice softened like a blade just before it cuts. No, you will. Because the world finally sees what Samuel saw all along. And now I'm just making sure Ethan never forgets it. The morning after Eleanor's final threat, Grace unlocked an old chest that had rested beneath her bed for 3 silent years. Inside, among handwritten notes and legal briefs, were photographs that the world had never seen. One in particular showed Samuel Whitmore with his arm wrapped tightly around a smiling woman with auburn hair and soft freckles. Her name was Emily Harper, and she had once been Eleanor's niece, the daughter of Thomas Harper, Eleanor's cousin, the same man Eleanor had betrayed 3 decades earlier to seize full control of the Whitmore fortune. Emily had grown up far from the marble floors of the Whitmore estate, raised by her disgraced father, who never spoke of the betrayal but wore it like a scar. Emily and Samuel had met in college, fallen in love under the shadow of family secrets, and kept their relationship hidden to protect what little peace they had left. But love, like truth, has a way of surfacing. When Emily died giving birth to Ethan, Samuel had been devastated. He turned to Grace, his best friend since their university days, and pleaded with her to raise Ethan, to protect him, not just from poverty, but from power. Grace remembered Samuel's trembling hands as he passed her a flash drive filled with documents, recordings, and a final letter. Don't let her take him, he wrote, and if anything happens to me, make sure Ethan knows the truth about his family. The truth, Grace now understood, was not just about money or legacy. It was about bloodlines twisted by greed, and about one woman's rise to power over the bones of her kin. As the press devoured Whitmore Industries, as federal agents raided Eleanor's estate, Grace stepped forward and released the one photograph Eleanor never wanted to see: Samuel, Emily, and newborn Ethan, together in a moment that could never be replicated. That image ran on the front page of every major paper, and with it came the name, Ethan Harper Whitmore, sole legal heir to both bloodlines. Eleanor's world collapsed faster than any court ruling could dictate. On the day of her arrest, Eleanor barely spoke. She simply stared at the photograph Grace had sent her, clutched between trembling fingers, knowing that the child she had tried to buy was the very embodiment of the family she had tried to erase. Her lawyers attempted to settle, $500,000, then $1 million. Grace rejected them all. Ethan isn't for sale, she repeated, like a sacred vow, and the world listened. Grace's team filed new claims with probate court. With Margaret's legal expertise and Dr. Fields' testimony, they reclaimed the shares Eleanor had stolen from Thomas Harper all those years ago. Ethan's future was secured, not through manipulation, but through the truth Eleanor had spent decades hiding. As Grace stood in the courtroom, Ethan's hand in hers, she turned to the rows of press and said simply, "Power built on silence cannot survive truth spoken aloud." And with that, the Harper name returned to the legacy where it had always belonged. 2 years later, the iron gates of Millbrook Women's State Prison opened with a groan as the guard called out, "Whitmore, you have a visitor." Dressed in a faded orange jumpsuit and with silver streaks now dominating her once pristine hair, Eleanor walked into the visiting room expecting a lawyer, maybe a journalist, looking for scraps of scandal. But there she stood, Grace, composed, radiant in a navy coat and soft cream blouse, holding a folder under her arm and a quiet calm in her eyes. "I thought you might like to know," Grace began, without sitting. "Ethan was accepted to Calbridge Academy, full scholarship, same school Samuel once dreamed of for him." Eleanor blinked slowly. "Why tell me?" "Because Ethan asked if bad people can become good," Grace said softly. "I told him sometimes they can, if they really try." She opened the folder and placed a photo on the table. Ethan in a blazer, violin in hand, grinning ear to ear. "He's learning the violin, His teachers say he's a natural, like his father. Eleanor picked up the photo and studied it like a memory she had never earned. And how are you affording all this? She asked, her voice more curious than bitter. The courts returned what you stole from the Harper family. It's in Ethan's name now. That fortune finally went where it was meant to, Grace answered, then paused. But what I got was something better. Eleanor raised an eyebrow. And what's that? Peace. A home filled with music and laughter. A child who knows that love isn't something bought, it's lived. Grace stepped back and gently added, he'll grow up knowing the truth. That legacy isn't built with money, it's built with presence. As the guards came to escort Eleanor back, she looked down at the photo once more, her fingers tracing the edges. She didn't cry, but something inside her, something rigid and old, cracked a little. Meanwhile, miles away in a lakeside home in Connecticut, Ethan ran across the garden shouting, Mom, I finished my song. Grace turned, smiled, and opened her arms. Play it for me, sweetheart. In the background, Margaret watched, a quiet pride in her eyes. The Harper name had returned, not as a headline, but as a legacy of love, truth, and redemption. True family had been rebuilt from the ashes, and justice had not come in wrath, but in patience, quiet, complete, eternal. Have you ever stood your ground when no one believed in you? Share your story in the comments, and remember, real power isn't inherited, it's earned.